domestic terrorism.
Domestic terrorism, terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic government law, government, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic law, domestic terrorism,
domestic law, domestic terrorism, government, domestic government law, government terrorism, domestic terrorism law,
domestic terrorism, government terrorism, government terrorism, domestic terrorism law,
domestic
government, domestic. I also think there's diminished domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
law, government, domestic law, domestic law,
domestic terrorism, government, domestic terrorism, domestic
law,
terrorism,
law,
domestic